Hello class, welcome back to part 2 of our manual exposure video. The first video we kind of covered the theory behind it all. So now we're going to use this free camera simulator website and just kind of put that stuff into practice. So let me show you the layout of this. It's going to be pretty similar to what you'll have on most of your cameras. You'll want to check your manual to see how your particular camera how to operate it, so which menus and buttons and wheels and dials to use to change your settings, but they're all going to do the same thing if they have an actual manual mode on it. So in the simulator we can kind of change our conditions. We can change how bright it is, how much sun, how far away we are from the subject. Think of this as we're walking closer to or further away from them. Focal length, this is like changing the lenses, or if you've got a zoom lens. So here's a wide angle where we can, our field of view is pretty wide. We can see a lot more to the sides versus something that's a lot closer up, kind of a telephoto lens. So not the same thing as physically moving closer or further away. Then we've got these different modes here. So here's manual mode. There's these other shutter and aperture priority. But we're going to go manual because once you understand these things, there's really no reason to use these other modes. We have the option to put the camera on a tripod or take it off. So you can see without the tripod, there's some motion from the camera in the photographer's hands as well as the girl moving. We put it on a tripod and we can see that it's eliminated some of that movement. She's still moving. And then these are the three things we just talked about from the exposure triangle. So we can manually set the ISO and decide how sensitive we want that sensor, or if we're shooting film, it would be like choosing a particular ISO of film. The difference would be that we can't change it from shot to shot with film. We can change the aperture and we can change the shutter speed. So I'm going to do, we'll take a few different scenarios here where we'll compare and look at what the image, we'll kind of compare what do we see in terms of those artifacts we talked about that you'll see depending on our aperture or shutter speed or ISO. So right off the bat, you can see it's sunny. Here's the light meter right here. So this is a really important part of this whole puzzle here is this light meter. Right now, with the little needle here in the center, it's saying it's a good exposure. When I change these settings as I go this way and I close down the aperture so it's a smaller and smaller opening, it's saying that this is going to be too dark by at least 2 whole f-stops. So right here it's pegged. If I go any further past that, it's going to be really, really dark. So you can see as I change settings, the needle moves. And that's just telling us, based on what we choose, is this image going to be too light or too dark? It'll still let us take a bad picture, but it's just saying, based on what you've chosen, this is what kind of exposure you're going to get. So let's pick something. So one thing I recommend to a lot of students when they want to learn this and really get a good feel for it is to take a very systematic approach and shoot pairs of images that they can compare with each other. So usually we'll do something like this with just aperture, and then we'll do a separate assignment where they would do the same with shutter speed so you can see what it does to motion. So let's shoot a version of this at f2.8, and then we'll go shoot another version at f22, and we'll use the light meter to help us figure out what the shutter speed needs to be, and if we need to move the ISO at all. Well, let's start with 2.8. So right now, light meter is saying this is going to be too bright. This is overexposed by at least 2 stops, maybe more. So I know if it's too bright, I need to take away some of the light that's getting in. So I'm going to do that by going with a faster shutter speed. The quicker the shutter speed, the less light is going to hit the sensor. So we keep going, and we get to 1/4000th of a second, which is a very fast shutter speed. Now it's saying that this will be a good exposure. So let's take the shot. Get rid of that. I've got a good shot here. All of her skin tones look correct. There's no highlights that are overexposed or blown out. When I look at the motion in the pinwheel, it's nice and sharp. It's all frozen. Even the amount that she was moving, we don't really see that anymore. We can see individual strands of hair here. So motion is nice and crisp. She's in focus, but notice the background is kind of blurred out, and that's a function of our f2.8. The depth of field is very shallow. So if you just remember, the smaller the f number, the less depth of field, the smaller the area that's going to be in focus. So when you're shooting at an aperture like this, it's very important that you focus exactly where you want it to, because if you focus, let's say we focus too far behind her, she would be blurred out and it would be unusable. When we go the other direction to a smaller aperture, like let's say f16 or something like that, you'll see a big difference in the depth of field. It's not quite as critical that you're focused exactly where you need to be, because the depth of field covers so much more of the scene. So let's take our other version. Let's go to f22. So now I change that. I can't just take the shot as it is, because what's the light meter telling me? It's saying this is going to be really dark. More than 2 stops, quite a bit more than 2 stops underexposed. So we would end up with something really, really dark. We've got to compensate with our shutter speed. So if I'm taking away light here, the aperture, the opening is smaller, a lot less light is getting through. I've got to give it back with the shutter speed. So that's what the light meter helps us do. So I say, okay, well, this was my decision. This was also my decision. This I'm not quite as concerned with. So let's see how far do I have to move it before the light meter says that'll be a good exposure. So it's saying 1/40th of a second. So that's borderline. She's probably going to be a little bit blurred. The pinwheel definitely. Let's take the shot. So she's, that's probably the limit. Any slower than that, and she would probably be a bit blurred. Pinwheel, definitely lots of motion in there. But look at the depth of field. See how different that is? At this aperture of f22, the depth of field extends back behind her enough that it covers basically the whole scene. So this is much sharper. So now you understand why I say at a smaller aperture like this, it's not, you don't have to be so perfect with your focus, because a lot of the scene is covered by that depth of field. Let's go back now. Let's do the opposite. So we're going to change the shutter speed. We're going to look more at the motion here, and the light meter is going to help us figure out what this needs to be. So let's do a really slow shutter speed. Let's see what would it take to give us, we want to see what motion looks like with a 1 second exposure. Right now the light meter is saying this is too bright by a lot. So let's, but we're kind of stuck. See, we can't, the aperture won't get any smaller, the ISO won't go any lower, so this is a situation where we just can't do this because there's too much light. There's filters we could put over the lens in real life that would cut out some light, but let's say we didn't have one of those. But we get lucky and some clouds roll through. And oh, look at that. Light meter says, you know what? When those clouds came in, that cut out enough light. We could actually get away with this. Let's take this shot. So at 1 second exposure, all the tones look about the same as the other shot. So her skin, how bright it is and how dark the shadow is, the same as our previous shots. f22, so we still have enough depth of field to cover the whole scene. But what's most pronounced about this is the motion. At 1 second, with her moving back and forth, even with the camera on a tripod, she's moving enough that over the course of a second, she blurs like this. So if I'd been hired by her parents to take a portrait of her, probably can't use this shot. So now let's go, we're doing this comparison. Let's go with our fastest shutter speed. So we go the other direction, 1/4000th of a second. It's still partly cloudy. Let's just leave that be for now. And so we took away a lot of light here with this really fast shutter speed. The light meter says it's way too dark. So I've got to give back over here with my aperture. So I open it up, and it's still too dark. because this shutter speed is so fast. You know, if the sun popped back out of the clouds, then all of a sudden, oh, this would work. If this stayed like this, then we would have to change the ISO. So let's do that so you can see what happens. So we'll bring it way up. It's a little underexposed. We'd have to kind of hope and cross our fingers that the sun maybe comes out a little bit more, but you know, on a day when the weather's changing, you're going to have to check with every shot, because it might be doing this to you. It's really dark, overcast, then it gets a little brighter, and then it's dark again, and then the sun comes out. So let's say, you know, we get this level of overcast. Light meter says that's a good exposure. We take the shot. Again, as far as her skin tones go, they're about the same. I would say the highlights are a little brighter and the shadows are a little bit darker. Well, you know, we set out initially with this shot to compare shutter speed with our slow shutter speed. So as a comparison of motion, we go, yeah, okay. The motion in the pinwheel's frozen. She's not moving. She looks like she's holding still. So that's, you know, nice to see what a 4,000th of a second can do. But, you know, because it got so dark with the overcast and we had to raise the ISO, this was the compromise we had to make. If you look, hopefully all of this comes through on your screens after you've seen it with the YouTube compression and all that. There's noise basically everywhere except these brightest highlights. You can see it's kind of grainy, especially in here. It's sort of, there's some hot pixels in there, and it just, you know, it's not that same nice texture that you get with film grain. This is kind of ugly. So if that was, you know, all we could do, it would serve, but it's not ideal. So let's go back here. So we say, yeah, that ISO is kind of nasty. So maybe we take a look at the sky and we go, you know what, in a couple minutes I can see that big cloud bank is going to pass, and then we're back to sunny. Now we look at the light meter and go, yep, it's too bright. Got to bring the ISO back down. That's a little underexposed. Let's take it. See, it's too dark. Motion looks good, but it's too dark. So we've really got to be paying attention to this with every shot. So we can bring the shutter speed back down a little bit. This is still a pretty fast shutter speed, 1,000th of a second. Get rid of that. They want us to pay some money. So let's look at this. Skin tones look good. No harsh highlights there. Shadows, we can actually see a little bit more in there. Motion this is really sharp. We can't tell that she's moving at all. Background is blurred out. That's because of our f2.8. But you know, again, if we've been paid by her parents to take this photo, it's safe to say they're more interested in her than the playground. We can see enough of it that we know what it is, but we don't need to see it that sharp. Our attention should be here. But the other thing to notice, there's no noise in this image because we chose ISO 100. So I hope that helped make sense of all that theoretical stuff that we just talked about. Again, take your camera, look up in your manual how to change all these settings. Each one's going to do it a little bit differently, but they all have the same capabilities here. Same idea that guides them all. So go out, practice it, do some aperture comparisons, you know, choose a wide aperture and a small aperture, use the light meter to help you figure out what your shutter speed compensation would be so you get a good exposure, something like this. Then do the same with motion. Find something that's moving. Could be, you know, a dripping faucet in your house. It could be, you know, an animal or kids, whatever you've got safe access to. And shoot a comparison of a slower shutter speed and a fast shutter speed, and then you're using the light meter to help you figure out what this needs to be, and if necessary, maybe you have to move the ISO a little bit. Yeah, so give it a shot. Want to share your results with us? Feel free to post it in one of our discussion forums so the others can see how your experiments went for you. And hopefully this demystifies manual mode